Thanks for sticking around. I think we'll have a good session. It's an interesting topic, especially for this conference. It's been interesting. I really enjoyed meeting a lot of people out in the exhibit halls. A lot of people really thirsty for learning, and that's refreshing. So thank you for letting us join this big party. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we have a problem here. This Jenkins tool is too good. Continuous integration is too easy. I mean, look at this place. The Jenkins user conference is amazing. Like, really, Jenkins is winning the war right now in the build management tools, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. I think this is definitely living proof. But here's the problem. We can do builds, and that's fine. And we have so many builds now, so quickly, so many a day. We had to invent a whole new category of tools called repositories, artifact repositories, code stations, artifactories, all these things, because we didn't know what to do with all this stuff because we're not used to having so many deployable artifacts. A very interesting problem, and that's where we see UrbanCode Deploy coming in. What if there was something better that we could do, or any continuous delivery tool? So that's what I want to look at today. So my name is John Lanuti. I'm from IBM Cloud. This is what IBM Cloud looks like now. You know, very different from maybe what you're used to, but it's refreshing for you. So hopefully we'll dive in here. Okay, so you're a Jenkins rock star. What's next? Like I said, we have a problem here. This is where the DevOps blame game comes in. Once you have those builds in the artifact repository, that's when you see the operations guys not trusting the developers, saying, oh man, these developers never test their code. How can they produce so much stuff? Every time I deploy it, I break something. I'm doing all the hard work here. Why can the developers just relax a little? The developers are saying, oh, Mr. Op guy, why are you guys so slow? I'm doing all the hard work here, writing all this innovative code, and you can't even put it into production. So really, we have a problem here. Jenkins is a great first step, but what do we do next? Continuous integration, great first step on your DevOps journey. But if you're ready for what's next, we'll talk about that. So the world is demanding, is your enterprise ready? And we'll look at that. And then we'll introduce IBM UrbanCode Deploy as one example for these solutions. And really, you know, there are a lot of great vendors, some that were earlier there today. Just use one of them, whatever you feel most trustworthy with. Just make sure you're thinking about who is innovating and who's thinking about the future and who can really handle an end-to-end story for you. And then I like to call Jenkins and UrbanCode Deploy is kind of like chocolate and peanut butter, but with better ROI. Because let me tell you, if you eat chocolate and peanut butter, it tastes good, but the ROI is not very good. And then I want to end off with where we're going, which is the cloud, futures cloudy, and how do we play into that story. So that's our agenda today. We may get into the tool, we may not. I don't know, we'll see. The demo is actually pretty boring. It's just a plug-in into Jenkins, but I'll show you what it looks like, and we'll see. We'll see how we go. Okay, so this was back in the day, or maybe it's you today. You're a startup or a smaller company, and you just have one team. And continuous delivery is not that much harder than continuous integration. You're doing code, you're starting your build, you're publishing those artifacts to a build, maybe you're sending an email, you're validating changes, and then you're committing. And that was very good. Maybe you have some gates. You have a development into a source control, into a build tool, maybe you do a system integration test, maybe just a user acceptance test. We can even get into production. And with one team, this isn't a big deal. I mean, we could even extend build tools to do this into the deployment space. With one team and one set of artifacts, pretty easy. But what's happening is, and especially with a lot of new trends, is we're breaking services down into smaller increments. So our services are getting much more fine-grained, which means we have much more dependencies that we may need to manage. And if you look at, as you start to grow as an enterprise and start to increase some of that technical debt Gene Kim was talking about earlier today, you realize the reality is, well, we've got multiple platforms. We've got a web platform, a mobile platform. We've got a database tier. We've got web servers, app servers. We got all sorts of different tiers with all sorts of different components, and we have multiple teams now. all of a sudden this easy deploy of, well, I've changed this component and I can just push it through each stage becomes a lot more difficult. How do I know what is the status of each one of those machines and what versions of the components that I'm expecting to be on those? And how do I manage all those different properties that may be different in each stage? We might have dozens of components across dozens of teams. So what's happening? And we may actually use third-party services. This will become more and more prevalent as we start to get into these concepts of microservices where everything is connected. What can go wrong? So think about everything, right? Murphy's Law. What can go wrong will go wrong. If we start at the left, you'll notice the developer environment. Tell me if you've ever heard this story. And I know, I'll just tell you that I come from a developer background, 16 years within IBM, and I did some Eclipse open source development. So I've done commercial and open source. So yeah, me and Gene Kim probably describe DevOps in the opposite way. I like to poke fun at the ops guys, from a development side, but we're all trying to get to the same place. But think about this, as a developer, we say, hey, I tested this. I'm on my Windows machine, and I ran against our server. And actually, I tested against Tomcat. And now we deploy to our production server, which is a clustered web server environment running on Linux. And lo and behold, things don't work. And what's the developer say? Hey, man, worked for me. That's your problem, ops guy. I saw it working. Well, wait a second. How did you test it? Did you have a production-like environment? No. And that happens a lot. The next one, we have time pressure. Again, going back to we have lots of tons of builds. Jenkins working great. But there's a bottleneck later down the cycle. All of a sudden, these changes are getting stored up. And this is really doing more damage than it is good, because it's very difficult to debug once we have a problem. And it's very difficult to roll back once we have all these cached up. And they're just sitting there collecting dust, giving us bigger debt. And then there's a lot of manual steps. I mean, there's a lot of times where we'll talk to people and they'll say, oh yeah, everything is automated. Is it? Okay, well, this guy pushes a button, and then he's got a sticky note on the wall that tells him to do his next steps, and then he can push another button, which may do some stuff. But it's essentially a set of manually orchestrated scripts and steps, and there's only a few people that know how to do it. And those people become very valuable, and they can get by on these heroic efforts. But all of a sudden, who did this, man? Dave. Dave's not here anymore. Uh-oh, trouble. And then the last one, you'll see some of these enterprises have major release parties. Why they're called parties, I have no idea, because it's a stressful weekend at best, if that's the shortest. And then you have people who actually designed to order breakfasts and dinners, and they have this Monday morning effect of where they're like, everybody's burnt out, it's the system, everybody's on high stress. Doesn't have to be like that, but that's the status quo of what we're seeing today. So some of the reasons for this should be pretty, you probably see this in your area. You have multiple systems, you have reliance on email, inconsistent environment setup, a lot of these heroes, they're error-prone deployments. Oh, they entered the wrong information in the ticketing system, it's not my fault. We have a lot of these scripts which may be copied and people are jerry-rigging them left and right, but we don't really know what they do, we just know we need to run them. We have a lot of different procedures which we manually go through, and developers may write and they hand it over to the ops guys, and we expect them to understand exactly what we mean, but they mess up a few steps. Yeah, that's probably happened. And then there may be also steps involved pre and post deployment where you think we're automated, but we actually have to do all this other stuff too. And then the maintenance becomes very difficult. How do we do configuration management? How do we manage all these scripts together? So these are some of the pain points that we see. It's not all inclusive. You probably have some of your own. But that's really the status quo today. So how can we fix this? What if we had something that was intuitive and scalable, that was able to manage the what, the how, and the where? So by the what we mean, how can we model our applications and understand what they are made of, and understand how I can group these things together and how I can push them through different environments? What about the how? How do I do that? How can I have something that's a reusable process? So if I deploy to dev and now I need to deploy to QA, and there's a different number of machines, wouldn't it be nice to just use that same process? I don't want to have to rewrite a whole nother process just because I'm at scale. This thing should just auto-scale with me. And what if there were different properties in dev and QA? Should I have to write a totally new script for QA, then for dev, then for production, just because there's different properties? Or should I be able to have some knowledge of the environments, where you see on the right, the where? Maybe the tools should know about what does each environment look like? What's the status of each environment? Which components are there? How do I get what's the difference between production and SIT and QA and dev? I'm expecting them all to be somewhat the same, but maybe there are differences that we weren't aware of. So what if we had a tool that could describe all of this? So we talk about the what, the how, and the where. So one example, and it's not the only one, but it's my favorite one, is IBM UrbanCode Deploy. Now, a lot of people have been coming by saying, what's the difference can we do everything with Jenkins? Why do I need UrbanCode Deploy? What about Chef and Puppet? What about this, that, these? The answer is you could probably do a lot of things with a lot of tools, but it might not be the best tool for the job. Like, I could hammer a nail in with a screwdriver, but that may not necessarily be the right thing to do. It may work sometimes, but other times it may hurt my hand. So that's what we're talking about here, fit-for-purpose tools that all work together to help you get more streamlined. So if you think about it, UrbanCode Deploy picks up right at that package repository level. So Jenkins and source control, like Git or Subversion, Team Concert, whatever you may be using, you do your development, you store in source control, you run the build, you put it into an artifact repository. That's where UrbanCode wakes up, and that's where it takes off, and we know how to manage the middleware, the applications, and the environment configurations. So everything to the right there is where UrbanCode really shines. And it is fit for purpose to do that. So you'll notice there's some little gates there that may look more like croquet goals, but those are denoting security gates. So between each environment, we could have a set of approvals or quality criteria, like you must pass unit tests or security tests, in order for us to push to each stage. And then all this is audible, right? We know exactly what's going on. So we'll get into some of this. You'll notice that we'll also show the process designer. This is one of the secret sauce here is, at the far right, you'll notice there's 130 plugins. And that means, how does UrbanCode Deploy integrate with Jenkins? Oh, we have a plugin for it. How does UrbanCode Deploy integrate with Microsoft IIS? We have a plugin for it. And what these plugins do is they wrap all the APIs of those specific tools, and we put those behind the scenes. And you can just drag and drop in that easy process designer that says, all right, stop Microsoft IIS, redeploy this application, restart IIS. And behind the scenes, we call everything we need to call, but you're not writing any scripts. So now we do this across all the different technologies. So you can take the same skills that you have about building processes and just apply the plugins. And there's like over 130 right now, and it's actually growing pretty rapidly. And we actually distribute those on a separate site or we can release them tangentially from our actual UrbanCode release, because it's just a third-party plugin. Most of them are IBM owned, but it's not baked into the product. I don't know if that made sense. But anyways, and the automation is scalable. Now what we mean by that is probably a topic of much debate, which says UrbanCode Deploy is a server agent model. And there are a lot of deploy solutions which are agentless. And this is the debate in the continuous delivery space of agent versus agentless. And here's why agent is better. Because of scalability. If everything has to go through a single server for every deploy, and maybe you're a store with 2,000 store locations, and I need to deploy, what does that look like? I now have a bottleneck on my server. Or what are the credentials for each server? I have to put all of that on the common server. Well, wouldn't it be better if I had an agent on each endpoint and I could deploy all those simultaneously with one process, and the agents just wake up and do their thing? Now we have scalability. Now we have a good model for us to grow on. So that's what we do with UrbanCode Deploy. A little bit of 101 groundwork here as we get into talking about how we integrate with Jenkins. Applications is a generic term. I guess you probably have a definition for that. But in our, what we're meaning here is some logical grouping of stuff that you're going to push together. And that's made up of components. So in a very simple case, it's some binaries, whether these are drawer files, war files, J2E, some sort of database schema, and then some configuration property files. All three of those make up an application. And we may have more, you may have two databases, you may have different binaries, but applications are broken down into components. So if you could think about like a pet store, we may have a web front-end user face, we may have a database back-end, and we may have some web services in the middle. We could deploy those as three different components as part of the same application. How do we do that? Here's how we do it. So the application deployments orchestrate the component deployments. Now, stay with me here. If you look at, we're talking about the left is, this is some of the stuff that we can't do with build tools, is we can start to do higher level models of ordering and how we should deploy the components. So if you look at the deploy the application, it's actually calling out to other processes, like the component process deployments. So the first thing we want to do is, so if we always had to deploy the J2E app before we deployed the database or vice versa, we could order that in the process definition for the application. And that way we know every time that we deploy the application, this is the order that we'll get. Now what this is saying is, we're going to start by deploying the app, and then we're actually going to deploy those other two things at the same time. So we're actually forking off the process, and we're saying, go ahead and do these together, because they're independent. And then we'll wait till they both finish, and then we'll finish the result. And there are other interesting things you can do, like if you see that green little check mark, that's a flag, which you could actually have a separate path which said, if the deploy app fails, go this way. If the deploy app succeeds, go this path. So there's some logic that you could put in there as well. And then when you look at the component deployment, at the right, that describes how we actually do that. So maybe we're downloading the artifacts from like an artifact repository, and then we're deploying to WebSphere, we're installing the application, and we're restarting WebSphere. That could be a simple sample process for the component. And then once we have these, we can reuse these across every deployment, across every environment. Now what's some of the advantages here? Well, for one, we're just dragging and dropping. We're not doing any scripting. We're setting a few properties. And these properties can be overridden. So in the environment for QA, we can override maybe the DB URL for what we had in dev, because it may be on a separate machine with a separate URL. But we don't need a separate process for that. We just have that property. We can control the execution flow, and we have tons of these plugins with tons of steps. There's 130 plugins, and they probably have 10 to 50 steps in each one of them. So there's tons and tons of integration points across other tools. Is that making sense? All right, cool. Okay. Now we also have the notion of a snapshot, which this is pretty cool. This will save you. So as you start to think about, well, our applications are getting a little bit more complicated. Maybe we have tens of 20 of components per application, and they're changing every day because we're doing continuous integration and continuous development. And all of a sudden we have all these versions of the components. Well, as a tester, maybe I would like to know which versions that the developer was working with in dev when he said all my unit tests passed. Or as a integration person, maybe I want to know the QA testers, what versions were they working on with their functional tests. So what we have the ability to do is take a snapshot, and this will capture the version of all the related components that are a part of that application. So the database, the configuration properties, any of the Java war files or DLLs, whatever technology it may be, we capture that as a snapshot. So that's a version set of components. And now think about how you may go from dev to QA today in how you might manually redeploy everything and follow this script, and maybe you miss one of the components, and oops, we forgot to update the database. Darn it. Well, this would never happen with the snapshot because we take that snapshot as a whole and remove that entire hole between the environments. So now we know exactly what we want, what's been tested. We can tag this for whatever we want to give around the version of that snapshot. So things like rollback, if you have a problem, you could always just roll back to the latest snapshot and redeploy those. Very easy. Similar to source control. Okay, and the last part here is the environment models. So again, this is the ability to model the actual resources that you may be deploying to, with the recognition that you may want traceability and an easy way to see what's happening. So we actually model what the resources are. So is it a single server, multiple servers? So you'll notice in SIT we just have one machine, which has all of our components on it. And maybe in UAT, we have two machines, database and a web machine. In production, we might have 100 machines. Well, we want to map that so we understand where we need to put all this stuff. And we want to be able to compare, what does UAT versus SIT look like, even though they have different, set of resources. And at the bottom, you see things like the properties that we've overridden. For SIT as a dev password, and production may have a production password. So this is another way that we can set environment-specific configurations. Okay, so the question was, if a separate team is managing production, then what is managing everything before production? How would we use the tool? So there's a couple ways to do that. One, if they're going to use UrbanCode Deploy, for example, you could have multiple servers with isolation, and you could import the binaries into the other UrbanCode Deploy server. So for example, in scenarios where there is no network connection and it's a federal lockdown from production to the other environments, that would be an example of you could carry the files over and import them into the other server and reuse the same process. Yep. Okay. Okay, yeah, so in that case, if we can poke through, then you could do it with the same server, and UrbanCode Deploy has a notion of, one of the advantages is it has a very rich security model. So we have roles within the environment, and roles can be assigned to people, and people can be part of teams, and teams can be assigned to a lot of the different, whether it's a component or an application or an environment. So what you would do is you create a production team that owns the production environment, and only people that have that production role or part of that production team would be able to touch production. That'd be the best way. Good question. All right, so if we put it all together, how does this whole thing look like? So we do a build. On the build completion, the latest artifacts are published to UrbanCode Deploy. Let me stop here and mention, there's been a lot of talk this week about different artifact repositories, and do we have to use them, or does UrbanCode have its own? And the answer is we can do either. So if you really like your repository or even your file system, no problem. You could publish from Jenkins to a file system or to an artifact repository, and UrbanCode Deploy can talk to those repositories. And if you're doing that, actually, there's no need to integrate to Jenkins from UrbanCode Deploy because we talk directly to the file system or to that repository. So kind of everything I'm showing you would be non-essential. But if you want to take the other path, which says, okay, at the end of a UrbanCode or a Jenkins build, I want to publish to UrbanCode Deploy's code station library, that's what this plugin is designed to do. So when the build runs, we publish the artifacts to the development environment in UrbanCode Deploy, and then we have the ability to do some things. These aren't required, but they're nice. So after deployment, we could start some automated tests, perhaps. We can provision some test environments and run some tests, and then we could add tags that say, has this passed the quality gate that we're looking for functional test? So in order for this version of the component to move to the next version, it has to pass these quality gates. And these can also be approvals. So we can ask for manual sign-off. So whether that's a role, like the dev lead, or specific individuals, we can ask for their approval before we go to the next phase. And that may be helpful for like production. So we talked about it a little bit early. Now you can secure your environments. And only the environments you want to secure. It could be that you don't care about security in any of the things pre-production or pre-SIT or whatever it is. Maybe you keep those, pretty loose. But then when you get later in the life cycle, you may want to notch up that security. So we make that very easy to do. And of course, as we are passing tests, we'll make a snapshot of all those component versions so that we can push the snapshot into production as a whole. And incidentally, another advantage here is if we look at my web app and only the WAR file changed, we could use the same process. We don't have to change anything. We just run our process, deploy that snapshot, and then it will ignore all the versions that haven't changed, and it'll just push the change as we need to. So again, that's going to save us a lot of time in deployment. Okay, so here's what it looks like. You may not be able to read that very, very good, but essentially, we install a plugin into Jenkins, and then as part of your post-build action section, you can add a post-build action for UrbanCode Deploy. And basically what you're going to do is you're going to tell it, what's the location of the server, what's the component I'm going to use, and then you have a set of properties that you can fill in about which files do you want me to include or exclude, or which directories do you want me to start at, and then you can ask to deploy. So as part of the Jenkins process, you can either just push the artifacts into the UrbanCode Deploy code station and do nothing more, or at the bottom there's a checkbox for deploy, and you can actually push a new version into UrbanCode Deploy and request that a deploy be made, and you can specify the environment that you want to deploy to and the process that you'd like to run. So pretty cool. As a developer making a change in Git, I release it, Jenkins build gets kicked off. If it's successful, we go in, we upload versions to UrbanCode Deploy, and we automatically kick off a deploy into whatever environment we wanted. Maybe it's a test environment, and I can immediately test my changes without having to touch any of those tools. All I was maybe in Eclipse doing Java development with the Git source control. So a good story there. There are other options, like if you don't want to use the plugin, we have a command line client, and that could be embedded also into your build files. So if you wanted to do a lot of fancy stuff, whatever that may be, you can get access to all of the UrbanCode APIs via command line. So just to recap that, what you want to do is there's a link in here for the documentation on how to do the integration. So I would suggest reviewing that. It'll have a link to the download, which is pretty small. It'll tell you how to install it into UrbanCode Deploy, install the plugin, and then you have to restart Jenkins so that it shows up. Then you'll add a profile to to Jenkins for the UrbanCode Deploy server. Make sure the URL is right and the password. And then for any job that you want to, you can configure a post-build action to publish artifacts to UrbanCode Deploy. Okay. All right, so there is more though, but wait, there's more. By going down the UrbanCode Deploy path, this is just the beginning of the UrbanCode platform, if you will. There are other tools out there. I won't mention the bottom one, which is UrbanCode Build. Jenkins is a good enough build tool in 98% of the cases, but just so that I don't get fired, I'll mention that we do have a build tool. But the two ones I do want to talk about, which are part of your application and release automation and orchestration, is UrbanCode Release, which has a nice tie into UrbanCode Deploy, but more at a higher level, and UrbanCode Deploy with patterns, which is sort of an emerging tool in space around this notion of OpenStack and software-defined environments. So let's take a quick look there. So what do we mean by, software-defined environment? Well, this is where we're talking about infrastructure as code, where all of a sudden an application and its infrastructure are no longer two separate things. They're really the same thing. My application and whatever I need to run it now is the same thing. Interesting idea, and there is a open standard committee called OpenStack, which I believe is one of the biggest open source projects right now. It may be the biggest active with number of commits. Don't quote me on that, even though it's being recorded. It's one of the biggest. And the whole idea behind that is good news for you. This is going to prevent vendor lock-in. The idea is we need sort of an operating system for cloud management, and that's what OpenStack does. So if I want to build a pattern that say, I'm going to run this database with this web server, and whatever else I need in there, maybe it's 10 machines, I can create that as a pattern, which looks like a PowerPoint, drag and drop type of a feel. And now I can deploy it to any OpenStack provider, be it IBM, be it somebody else, and away you go. And if at any point you don't like your cloud provider and you have the right contract, you could drop it and switch providers. So that's pretty awesome. And it's also one standard that we can start to wrap our heads around on how we do this pattern development. And it's very popular within IBM. We were kind of ahead of the curve, I think, when we started creating our own pattern a while ago. And there's a lot of things moving to OpenStack within IBM. So what UrbanCode Deploy with patterns does is it allows you to do a rich drag and drop and create these pictures like in number 2, where we have a set of web servers, a set of app servers, a set of database servers. We see the connections between them. We can put in things like load balancers, firewalls, and then we go ask the heat engine, which is the OpenStack engine, which can then deploy this environment. And once we deploy the environment, we can use our UrbanCode Deploy, which is baked into UrbanCode Deploy with patterns, to update the application as we need to. So now that's a really easy spin up and spin down as a developer. If I need to do some tests, or as a tester, I need to spin up some tests for performance, and I want to spin them up, run a bunch of stuff, and then tear them down, and I might be able to do that repeatedly. This is going to give me that very easily. And you'll notice number 3, we've actually done some homework to make it portable across some things that may even be not OpenStack. So we do work with VMware vCenter, we work with IBM OpenStack, and any OpenStack provider. And we do also work with Amazon Web Services and SoftLayer. SoftLayer, for those who don't know, is the IBM answer to Amazon EC2, which is an infrastructure as a service. Okay, and what is UrbanCode release then? So if you think about what UrbanCode Deploy does, it looks at, okay, I've got applications which are made of components, and I know how to deploy and automate those. Now, as you get into a bigger group, you may start to realize we have more than one application, and these things are starting to be interrelated. And we may have a release train that everybody's getting on, or we may want to map and manage when everybody's releasing their applications, because I might want to make sure that I'm testing with the latest versions of those applications. And that's where UrbanCode release comes in. It's more of this high level across applications. How do I check status of which stage each application is at, and which versions of those applications are in each environment. So it's kind of blurry, but in the picture there, what I was trying to show was, as you go across, those are the different environments, like dev, QA, prod, and then going down are the applications, and in the middle are the versions. So and those are based upon the application snapshot version. So what we would expect to see is kind of a progression from maybe the latest versions are in dev, and in production are more the stable versions. And we can start to see, when does this when are they going to pick up this version, et cetera, and when are they going to make it to this stage? So very easy, high-level pipeline type view. We can also do calendaring. That may show at the bottom there. about, again, across different applications, where are they at in their calendar. And then we get to release impact, so we can also actually see the work items here coming from things like Jira or Team Concert that are related to the releases, and how are we doing if we need to drop one of those, or what's the status of those work items. So a lot of risk management, a lot of enterprise calendaring, and there's some orchestration we can do here as well. So if we want to do things like automated progression across environments, we can start to do that with UrbanCode Release. So there's a little bit of overlap because they both have quality gates, but if you think UrbanCode Deploy is for automation, for applications, UrbanCode Release is more for that higher level, more like city planning. We need to orchestrate across multiple applications. Sure. ServiceNow and UrbanCode Deploy. I'm pretty sure we have a plugin for ServiceNow. I could check. Is this still not coming up? Okay, hang on. I'll show you how to fish by answering that. So all the plugins that you may ask about, if you go to UrbanCode and type plugins, you'll come to this page. And this lists all the UrbanCode Deploy plugins, and then you can start to do a search. Like, oh, there's Jenkins, so we have a plugin for Jenkins. Oh. Service, yeah, there's ServiceNow. And then once it shows up, you can click on it. It'll take you to more details about that plugin. So usually it'll give you a download, and that will install, and the available steps will usually show. So what this means is within a UrbanCode Deploy process, these are the things we can call by drag and dropping these steps, which will communicate with ServiceNow. Okay, it says it was released 2013, November. I don't know if that's when the latest, or that, I don't know exactly when it was first released. I'd have to look. Maybe this is the first? So I'm not sure. Oh yeah, the question was when was it released originally. I think we're showing the latest version, not the first version. Click it. This is never good when the attendees are driving the demo. September 19th. Is that the same? So maybe this is the first one. Yeah, looks like there's no prior. Sure. Hey, where's slides go? Come back over. Oh, 1 second. Oh, we're back. Okay, so, oh yeah, this may be a little salesy. I have to apologize here. But some of the results you can see, if you look at each one of these, they're real results. That's the only reason why I show it is a lot of people have tremendous success with these continuous deployment tools because things like Jenkins are so popular that there is such a problem about the bottleneck has just moved down the life cycle. And you can really you could be heroes by adopting one of these tools. I mean, seriously, some of these, they've released deployment time from 2 to 3 days to 1 to 2 hours. That's huge. Cost avoidance of $2.3 million. At the top right, they reduced deployment time by 95%. And you'll see these run across all these different industries. Okay, so where are we going and what's next? what is next is cloud. The future is cloudy. So if you look at the top left, focus on that for now, not the bottom right. The bottom right is the answer. I should have had this animated, but such is the life of a technical person. So at the top left, it's the blame game. The he broke it. The developers are saying operations is too slow. The operations guys are saying the administrators are always breaking things. The network guy keeps stuffing stuff in, and we've never tested it. We never deploy the same thing twice. Holy mackerel. And the business user is like, when can I just get my features? Seriously, let's go. What's taking you guys so long? And nobody is happy. Everybody is distrusting. This is not a good place to be. This is what they call the death spiral. Releases start to take longer. They become more intricate and more error-prone, and it starts to get worse and worse and worse. So we need to break that. And the way that we can do that is really by adopting, two things. Gene Kim talked about we need to adopt DevOps, and that's what we need to do. But how do we make DevOps real? And one of the ways to do that is adopting cloud infrastructure, ways to provision applications in their environments very rapidly, and to be able to tear them down and do that very repeatedly. He mentioned being able to test into production-like environments. How do we do that if we aren't using some sort of a cloud technology? It's going to be very costly and error-prone. So what we want is the DevOps team at the right, where everybody is happy and high-fiving each other, going after the same goals, delivering a pipeline automation by leveraging cloud where it makes sense and cloud infrastructure as a service where it makes sense, but by managing the middleware. So what we mean is we need to have an intersection of the tools that we're using to deploy this stuff, self-service IT when appropriate, so developers can push buttons, get access to the environments they need, limit the amount of ticketing that we're opening. But how do we do that, and how do we have the appropriate amount of governance and the appropriate amount of ways to charge people for using all these environments? And that's where the management platform comes in. So we need some sort of orchestration for this cloud. We don't just need something like EC2. We also need something to manage that and to govern it. We need some pattern technology. And that's where things like UrbanCode Deploy with patterns, that's where cloud orchestration comes in, and that's where self-service IT becomes really a great story for developers. Because if you can make the developer's life happy and easy, that they don't have to waste time, then they're going to actually test. If they have quick access to environments, developers will test. And they will let go of environments. I know a bunch of developers that never give back test environments or dev environments because it takes too long to get them. They just keep them for release to release. And that's very hard to manage, and it becomes very costly. So what we want is this DevOps team. But how do we really get there, And that's where another picture of that would be using the products I was just talking about is UrbanCode Deploy becomes the central piece of this whole hybrid cloud story. No longer do you need a different tool to deploy to stuff that's on-prem versus what's in an emerging platform like Docker. UrbanCode Deploy can deploy to Docker. What about Cloud Foundry? UrbanCode Deploy has a plugin for Cloud Foundry. Well, we got all these mainframes. There's no way we can have an orchestrated process that, oh, well, wait a second. UrbanCode Deploy has a mainframe plugin as well. So we can deploy to mainframes all the way out to these emerging cloud standards. So that's the idea behind this picture. Between UrbanCode Deploy at the application deployment level and UrbanCode Deploy with patterns at that OpenStack infrastructure as code, between the two of those, we can start to hit at all these different resources from systems of record, which we mean by data, stuff that may be on-prem, stuff that may be on-prem forever, even though, I'll leave that at that. And then there is the system of engagement, which is things that change very rapidly. And we want to be able to have what they call a two-speed delivery here, or two-speed IT, which is very difficult to maintain when one system of record, like mainframes, are resistant to change, and the systems of engagement, like Cloud Foundry, really want to push change fast as possible. So having a single tool to orchestrate across those will be a huge advantage. And then, of course, UrbanCode Release will be managing all those releases together. All right, I think that was it, and we'll take questions now. Okay, so the question was, does UrbanCode Deploy keep track of the version that you've deployed? And maybe I will try and show this. Did that show up? That didn't show up. Bear with me 1 second. Ah, there it is. Okay, yeah, sorry, I can't see it on my screen here. That's why I'm kind of, I'm having some monitor issues looking backward. So here is the environment for the JPet Store application. And you'll notice at the bottom there is the SIT environment, and you may not be able to read it, but there's the web component, the J2E component, and the database component, and it's showing you the version that's been deployed to that environment. So we know exactly the versions that we have deployed in each environment. Okay, so the question was, for the environments and for the applications, do we need to create it from scratch, or do we just associate, I think was. So, and what does create new environment? Create new environment means, for this application, what do our environments look like? And this is sort of like a model of what they are. And what we would do is, there is some resources that are attached to those environments. So that's where we could map. So what this is saying is, I want to have a SIT environment that has these 3 components in it. But we would also have a resource that's assigned to this environment. And we model the resources as well. Those can be created from scratch each time, or they could be shared, or we can create a resource template that says, for every SIT, this is what it looks like, so you'll use that template. Okay, I think the question was, how do we handle rollbacks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or either in manual rollback.
All right. Okay, so there's a couple ways to do rollbacks, and a lot of times, if you ask people, what they really want to do is a roll forward. You know, what we want to do is fix it and deploy a new version. So that's one way to do it. And a rollback, it's really essentially just a deploy of a separate version. So if I click to run this process on SIT, it's going to ask me for a snapshot. And I can pick any version that I want to. So a rollback could as easily be, just go back to the previously known good snapshot. All right, that's my time. Have a good weekend.